All right, so this time we're going to be talking about allegedly the first philosopher of the Western tradition, as well as what he sort of spawned, which we call the Milesian school. And the reason for that is because our wonderful first philosopher, Thales, was born and lived in the coastal city called Miletus, which is it's around Turkey. It's over on that other side of the Mediterranean. And so because he came from Miletus, he was a Milesian, and so several of the philosophers who followed after him were called the Milesian school. And so these were sort of the first philosophers in Western tradition. Now the thing about Thales is he really kickstarts this and thus sets the tone for philosophy for pretty much the whole story, you know. Not that people aren't challenging him, but he's the first one to do it, so he sets the background on which everything ends up building. And he was the first Greek to say, essentially, I don't think that nature is capricious, like we've been taught to think. I think that nature, kind of like Homer's fate, adheres to strict orderly laws, and if we can learn those laws, then we can predict nature, and then we wouldn't be at its mercy, and then we wouldn't be dying all the time, you know. So this revolutionary idea that we can actually figure out what the laws of nature are, these are expressed in two of Thales' famous teachings, or if you want to say aphorisms. The first one is, all things come from water, and we'll explain what that means. And two is, the gods are in all things. So those are kind of cryptic statements, at least to us, so they'll require elaboration. The first statement is the first remotely scientific claim in Western thought. And the reason is this is where Thales proposes an everyday, non-sentient substance as the fundamental thing in reality, as the foundation of reality. Previously, people thought of the world as simply the world and all the junk that's in it. Thales, however, is proposing that individual things in this world are actually related to each other on a more fundamental level. You know, me, the desk, you, your computer, or whatever you're watching this on, this book, the paper in my backpack, you know. Thales is saying, no, these aren't separate things. They are, but really they're just different manifestations of the same thing. So if we study that more fundamental thing, then we'll learn something that applies to all of these things, and we'll understand why they behave in certain ways. So you see, this is a very different way of going about it. Thales proposed that they can be analyzed in terms of their common cause, and in this case, he says that what the common cause is water. We don't know why he chose water, but it's not nearly as important as the fact that he chose something to be the fundamental, and particularly that he chose something that already existed. He said it's water, so you can imagine that it could have been that he watches plants. You water the plant, and the plant gets bigger because the water is turning into more plant. You'll see how the water will wash up on the shore and will leave shells there. So you can see where his train of thought probably went. But what's more important than that is his proposition introduced the first sort of major philosophical quandary. Is sort of the first real problem in philosophy, and this is called the many versus the one. And the question is reality just the variety of perceivable objects? Is it what we experience that's really real? Is the table just fundamentally just a different thing? Or is it the categories into which we divide these objects that is the more real thing? Is reality just the variety of perceivable objects, or are the categories into which we divide those objects more real? So, for instance, which is more true, the raw data or the patterns that we see in that data? Right? Like, we're inclined to say it's the data, because We actually went out and experienced that when we were gathering it. But is that to say that the patterns are just completely in our mind and that they don't have any bearing on the situation? Because we analyze patterns and data all the time, and this seems to work and be able to guide our action in the right way. Are the plants, the rocks, fish, and people, are those the real things? Or is it the water from which they supposedly came? Is that what we should be focusing on? Is that what's really real at the bottom of this? Well, in any case, Thales' second claim that the gods are in all things, this relates very much back into his idea of everything being orderly. What he meant by that is this: people of his time believed that the gods were responsible for acts of nature. So Demeter causes the crops to grow, for instance. The crops themselves don't grow. It's by virtue of some god or deity apart from the crop. So the impetus of natural events, the cause of natural events, is separate from those events. Therefore, if we want to understand those events, we should turn to the appropriate god. You don't analyze the crops to figure out why they're not growing. You pray to Demeter to find out why she caused them to not be growing. Thales, however, says this is dumb. Well, that's not what he says. What he says is that the gods are in all things. In other words, the impetus, the cause for natural events, is embedded in the natural events themselves. Crops grow because it is in the nature of crops to do so, and not because some capricious god said that they were going to grow. Therefore, if you want to understand nature, you examine nature itself. Look, see how this literally revolutionized everything. And we listen to this and we think, well, obviously, we know it's obvious because of Thales. This was Thales' idea. This has just completely changed everything. I don't know if people, I'm sure people had probably come up with this before. You've got quite a few millennia before Thales. But for whatever reason, in the Western world, it had died out, it had been forgotten. And Thales, for our generation, is the one who brought it back. Now, in any case, these two ideas, we may conjecture, as I said before, are an outgrowth of Homer's idea of fate. Remember that unpersuadable force that's even higher than the gods. So Thales may have been, it's not clear if he ever claimed this, but may have been giving a more rational and predictable form to Homer's inhuman force. Now, in any case, you can, as I was saying before, from Thales comes all of natural science, because once you say that the universe is orderly and that we learn about it by observing nature itself, and you make rational conjectures, well, that's where science comes from, and you refine that process, and you start to learn about the world, and you learn how to predict it and control it. And there's a lot. You'll notice that there's a lot more self-reliance here. It's a lot more reliable in and of itself, and it allows you to have a lot more personal pride. And all of those things are much less when you have to follow traditional rituals. So this attitude cultivates in the Greeks a very famous curiosity. They really want to know things. This idea from the Milesians really kind of starts to take control, and the Greeks really become great scientists, very, very smart, very learned, very curious, wanting to know what's really going on at the bottom of things. So Thales had sort of two main successors. The first was Anaximander, but we're going to talk about him after this next one, because we saved the best for last, actually, because the other one was the younger Anaximenes, who's a very, very good example of the Greek curiosity that started to come out of Thales in the Milesian school, because Anaximenes was much more popular than Anaximander, even though he's much less important for us. Anaximenes was much more of a scientist of his time. He's a very good example of the Greek scientist. Very curious, made a lot of astonishing discoveries for his time, but not particularly astonishing for our time. So that's why Anaximander is much more interesting to us, because his theories were much more abstract. But Anaximenes is interesting for one major idea, that he took Thales' idea of the fundamental substance being water, and Anaximenes says, well, I'm all for the fundamental substance, but I think a better choice is air, this other element of air. So if you take air and you compress it down, to a dense enough state, then it'll become something harder. It'll become water. It'll become more solid, and it'll become flesh, bone, rock. Or if you take it and you thin it out, you rarefy it, then it will become fire. So what's interesting here is that you can take air, and according to numbers, the amount that you compress it down will create new elements. So there's a certain degree, it's very subtle, but there's a certain degree of the beginning of a mathematical approach to science, where you can reduce everything to numbers, and from that will come formulas. It's an easy enough step from what Anaximenes is doing, and it's something that is taken up in a certain way by Pythagoras later on. So that's certainly influential on science, but not so much his actual discoveries. Anaximander, on the other hand, is much more interesting to us as philosophers, because I'll just explain to you, he also was interested in Thales' statement that the fundamental substance is water. And he was sort of Thales' direct successor, and was a devout follower of Thales, but he ran into in his mind, he ran into some problems with Thales' theory of water, which is mainly this: if the fundamental substance is one of the things in our experience, if the thing that accounts for all the things in our experience is itself something that is in our experience, possessing, its own distinguishing properties in experience, well, then how can it account for things that have contrary properties? So, for example, according to Thales' view, it would appear that water can account for fire. But wouldn't that require it to cease being water in the sense we're used to it? So what I mean is, water is wet, cool, and flowing. For instance, we could say that it's those things. But if water accounts for all things, including those things that are dry, warm, and solid, then is it really water anymore? Right? So are we saying that, wet, cool, and flowing properties are much more real than what is dry, warm, and solid? You see what I'm saying? So wouldn't it make more sense to have some substance that has no properties of its own, at least not perceptible properties, which could then account for both water and fire equally? We wouldn't run into this problem of water trying to become fire, and then you start wondering, well, is it really water, or is it something underneath them? So Anaximander's fame for us comes from his positing another original philosophical idea, a principle as explanation, a principle abstracted from our sense experience, something that we can't see, feel, and touch, because it's used as the explanation for everything that we can see, hear, feel, and touch. So in his case, he calls this propertyless, or without property, abstract, fundamental substance, the boundless, or sometimes the infinite, although the boundless, I think, is a better translation. It's called the boundless because there is no boundary or limit to its quote-unquote metaphysical jurisdiction, the things that it can explain, its capacity to explain things. Being itself without properties, it's therefore without any limitation to its ability to become anything it wants to explain anything. So this is obviously very influential on philosophy later on, not necessarily in his own day, but certainly in the long run. And one of the people to take that up to a great degree and to be very influential is Xenophanes, who is also the very first philosopher to officially and in front of everybody denounce the Homeric gods. And so we see how Greece was pulled out of its rather, in my opinion, ugly infancy by the Homeric gods, but now they seem to be outgrowing that stage through Xenophanes, and that's what I'm going to talk about next time. So I hope that this was interesting and useful and it made sense, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.